we want to be respectful of your time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll just, lay out some of the broad themes, and then Glenn will come up and walk through the actual slide presentation, and then I'll come back to the podium and take any questions you may have. But the bottom line is, I think what we expected and thought would happen yesterday did in fact occur, which is a historic turnout of voters of faith, fueled by the largest turnout of evangelical, self-identified evangelical voters since exit polling began. According to the network exit polls, it was 26% of the electorate. They voted 81 to 16% for Donald Trump. That is the largest share of that vote ever received by a Republican presidential candidate. It is higher than George W. Bush got in 2004 when he received 78% of that vote. Mitt Romney topped that high of 78% 4 years ago. John McCain and Bush, I'm doing this from memory, but this is roughly right, both got 68% in 2000 and in 2008. Very significant. Probably not what most people would have predicted when Donald Trump rode the escalator down to the lobby of Trump Tower on June 18th of 2015. If you slice the electorate a different way, where instead of asking somebody if they've had a born-again conversion experience or they self-identify as an evangelical Christian, these are terms of, not exactly crisp theology, and in some communities of faith, they're not accepted. There are people who have a very devout, strong faith, but they won't subscribe to that term. So we also ask them, as we have been asking for years on post-election surveys and other polls, whether they consider themselves to be a conservative Christian. That number was 33% of the electorate. It is also the highest ever recorded. The previous high was 31%. And they voted for Donald Trump 79 to 15%. I think just as significantly, and by the way, I should say that those numbers, 81% and 79%, really understate the role that the vote played, because it's a national number. If you go state by state in these battleground states and drill down and look at those individual exit polls, the numbers are frankly staggering. I put some of them in the release that I think everybody has. In Florida, evangelical voters, they were 1 out of every 5 voters in Florida this year. They voted 85 to 13 for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. In Wisconsin, they voted 71 to 24%. In Georgia, they voted 88% for Trump to only 6% for Hillary Clinton. Her national number of 16% is the lowest ever recorded in an exit poll for a Democratic presidential candidate. And I think that there are a couple of reasons for this. I'll save most of my kind of explanatory view and analysis for your questions, but I think there are 2 things that happened here. One was a positive and the other was a negative. It was like a battery with 2 charges. And I'll start with the positive. Donald Trump made the most full-throated, aggressive, and unapologetic appeal to evangelical voters that we have arguably seen in a general election environment since Ronald Reagan spoke to the Religious Roundtable in August of 1980, the first public appearance that he made after accepting the Republican nomination. Donald Trump was at Regent University doing a rally with evangelicals and Pat Robertson on October 22nd. He went to our conference, the Road to Majority Conference, after wrapping up the nomination. In June, he went to the Value Voter Conference in September after accepting the nomination in Cleveland. He did sit-down interviews with the Christian Broadcasting Network, with EWTN, and with any number of religious outlets. And for the most part, without casting aspersions on prior campaigns or candidates, the modus operandi in the National Republican Party has been to embrace these voters, their leaders, and their organizations and issues in the primaries, and then keep them out of camera range and at arm's length in the general election for fear that they would alienate other voters. Donald Trump never played with that playbook. He made these voters of faith a centerpiece of his campaign and his strategy for victory from the beginning. And following that on, if you look at the issues that he took positions on, whether it was his pro-life position, saying that he would defund Planned Parenthood as president, his opposition to the Iran nuclear deal, his saying that we would have a friend of Israel in the White House again, his support for traditional marriage, his foursquare stance on appointing strict constructionists and respecters of the original intent of the founders when it came to constitutional jurisprudence, his release of 20 names from which he ultimately said he would choose a replacement for Antonin Scalia, his description in the third debate of why he was pro-life and why he believed that partial birth abortion and late-term abortions constituted a grave evil, and indeed, as Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan once called it, infanticide. These were all clear and bright lines of demarcation that separated him on core and defining issues for voters of faith from his opponent. The negative charge was his opponent. Hillary Clinton was not only on the opposite side of all of those issues, she was the first nominee of the Democratic Party to be endorsed by Planned Parenthood in the primaries. In fact, something that was little noted at the time, on the day that Donald Trump spoke to the Faith and Freedom Coalition here in Washington, I believe that was on June 10th, on that same day, Hillary Clinton was right across town speaking to Planned Parenthood. She not only said that she favored continuing to fund Planned Parenthood after the controversial videos that showed them violating numerous statutes by engaging in the trafficking of fetal body parts and fetal tissue, she said that she was in favor of increasing funding to Planned Parenthood. She defended late-term abortions in the third debate. And these were all things that really brought a tremendous level of moral clarity to what evangelical and other voters of faith ultimately saw as a binary choice. So that's why I think it happened. With that, I'll turn it over to Glenn Bolger, who I'm biased because we have used Glenn from the inception of our organization, but he and I have a professional relationship that far precedes that. I have spoken to Glenn on election day just about every election for the past decade. He's not only never been wrong, I think he's one of the best pollsters in either party today, and he'll walk you through the specifics of the numbers. Glenn.
Thank you. A difference between Ralph and I is that we were both up, given our exchange of emails, till the wee hours of the morning, and then got up bright and early. Well, he's bright. I was up early and talking then, and of course, Ralph gets up and gives an exquisite display of command of his subject, and I've got to refer to my notes because I'm wiped out. But just to add a couple of things to what Ralph said in terms of the data, he talked about the exit polls showing that born-again or evangelical white Christian vote was 26% of the electorate, and they voted for Trump 81-16 over Clinton, and just 3% voted for other candidates. What that means is the 74% of the voter the electorate that's not white, born-again evangelical Christians, they voted for Clinton 59-35 with 6% for other candidates. So President-elect Trump ran 89 net points better with white born-again evangelical voters than he did with the rest of the electorate. So it's pretty clear that Ralph, his organization, and people of like minds of faith can say that they are the group that was the driving force behind Donald Trump's victory. Again, net 89 points stronger. Ralph also mentioned that we had asked people to rate themselves on I'm sorry, let me back up for a second. Along with referring to the exit polls, Public Opinion Strategies also does an election night survey of actual voters. We do all 800 interviews in one night among people who've either early voted or voted on election day. 44% of our interviews were done with cell phones, just to get the methodology out there. I think it's also on the second page of my memo to Ralph at the bottom. And we asked them to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10, how well the phrase "a supporter of the conservative Christian movement" describes them. 33% of voters, as Ralph noted, rate themselves as an 8 to 10 on that scale. And that's kind of the classic break. Whether we ask about business groups, environmental groups, whatever it is, those 8 labor unions, those 8 to 10 voters are the ones who are kind of the most committed. And there's not that much difference between the two groups. I mean, the three, whether you say 8, 9, or 10. Well, though that 33% voted for President-elect Trump 79 to 15 over Secretary Clinton. And what that means is all other voters broke 2 to 1 for Secretary Clinton. Donald Trump got 29% of their vote, 57% voted for Secretary Clinton. And then we asked both Trump and Clinton voters very similar questions about their vote motivation. And let me just read that to you. Which best summarizes why you voted for Donald Trump? Donald Trump will bring real change to Washington. 60% of his voters said, yeah, that's me, that describes me. That's why I best vote. That's the best summary of why I voted for him. 20% said because Donald Trump shares my views on the issues, and 14% because Donald Trump shares my moral beliefs and values. We asked the same question of Clinton voters. We did drop the word moral just so they didn't opt away from that because they are less likely, Clinton voters, Democrats, those who are less likely to react well to the word moral. And 41% said it's because Hillary Clinton shares my views on issues. And a similar response is 36% Hillary Clinton shares my beliefs and values. And only 13% because Hillary Clinton will bring real change to Washington. So this was very much an election that was driven by the change dynamic. And for Donald Trump and his voters, that was extraordinarily important. And I think, what you see is and the Clinton voters were motivated by issues and beliefs and values. Trump voters focused like a hawk on changing Washington. And they didn't necessarily demand that their candidate share their religious beliefs or practices, and they didn't see him negatively because he's not evangelical born again. But what they do is share his vision for change and appreciate his support and his pledge to. They support his pledge to fight for change. So I think that's an underlying dynamic of it. Just one or two more notes among white Catholics. I want to make sure I've got these data right, and I think I do. Among white Catholics, this is on page 6 of the presentation, the PowerPoint. They voted for Trump 54 to 37. So they certainly helped put him over the top along with white evangelical born-again Christians. And then what's also striking is on page 7, the faith gap that exists among Protestant voters, regardless of ethnicity or any other factor, just Protestants, 59 to 34 in Trump's favor. Catholics a little bit more evenly divided, 47-44. Again, that doesn't conflict with the earlier data about white Catholics, because obviously you've seen in the exit polls that Trump, even though he did better than Mitt Romney among Latinos, Latinos still voted heavily, and they are heavily Catholic. They still voted heavily for Secretary Clinton. But among those who said, no, I don't have a faith, or it's something other than that, they voted for Clinton 66 to 21. So again, you can see the power of the religiosity vote that propelled Donald Trump to the presidency. And with that, I'll invite Ralph back up because he's a lot better at answering questions at this time of the day after Election Day than I am. Thank you.
I guess I better do this if you mind. I think it would be potentially instructive if we could just look at one slide. I don't know who's controlling the slide. Am I controlling the slide? If so, how do I, okay, there we go. Oh, what, I don't even recognize this. Yeah, this is not the slide presentation that we're supposed to have, Lance. That's okay. Glenn, if you can look at your PowerPoint or maybe hand it to me, this was what I wanted to share with you. If you take the evangelical vote and you imagine visually the electorate as a pie, and the evangelical vote being a very large piece of that pie, basically 1/4 of the pie, and you take that pie out, that piece of pie voted for Trump 81 to 16%. If you look at the rest of the pie, meaning every other voter in the electorate that did not self-identify as a born-again or evangelical Christian, they voted 59 to 35% for Hillary Clinton. Page 4. So if these voters had either stayed home, as some thought they would do, or if the rapture had occurred, good, you didn't get a lot of sleep last night either, but you're here. Donald Trump would have lost this election by a sort of Johnson-Goldwater type margin. It's very, very significant. We knew that we were looking at something big when we did our phone banking for the final weekend, and Tim Head, our executive director, John Harbison, our field director, they were the ones who were really running these trains. And as we did our digital ads, we did 26 million digital ads that reached approximately 3.8 million voters in the key states. These were going directly to their mobile devices. We were knocking on doors. We knocked on 1,253,778 doors in the top 11 states. Those were both Senate and presidential key states. We were distributing voter guides. We were dropping mail. We were doing all these things, and it was all directed at a universe of 15.6 million voters in approximately 9.5 million households in these 11 states. And every night as we went, we would bump our universe for all of those aspects of our ground game up against the early votes, so that if you had voted early, you no longer got digital ads to your mobile device. If you voted early, we skipped your house when we door knocked. We took all of our resources and we moved the metal that was hitting that target and we redirected it to people who hadn't voted yet. And when we did our purging for the final weekend, 48% of the entire universe had already voted. Now, that included states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and many other states that don't even early vote. There would be some absentee voting. I had never in my career, and I have been doing this for 27 years, never seen an early vote number for this constituency that exceeded the mid-30s. So we knew something big was happening. What we could not project was what would happen to their voters and her voters. In other words, what would the African American vote be? How big would the Hispanic vote be? How big would the millennial vote be? But there was never any doubt in our mind. And I'll say this one last thing and then I'll open it up for questions. This was my 10th presidential cycle. I have never seen a time, whether it was Obama in 2008, whether it was Reagan in 1980, or whether it was Trump this year, where the primary vote spiked, but those same voters didn't turn out in a general. In my experience, if you vote in a primary, you're coming in the general. So we always believed they would come in huge numbers, and we always believed he would win them overwhelmingly. But I have to say the 79 and the 81% numbers for conservative Christians and evangelical born-again voters, that surprised me. I was going to be very surprised if he broke Bush's number of 78%, and he did it, and I think I've explained our analysis of why we think that happened. So, and I'll stress one last thing. The material that I described, the mail pieces, the voter guides that were in church bulletins or in church pews, the digital ads, everything we did, none of it expressly advocated the election or defeat of a candidate. They not only were fully compliant with voter education guidelines governing 501c4 issue organizations, they were in full compliance with 501c3 regulations. It was a broad range of issues. If anybody wants to see a copy of it, we'll be happy to show it to you. I think there were 10 issues: tax issues, budget issues, the Iran nuclear deal, abortion, marriage, immigration. It was a broad range of issues, and we fairly and accurately described where the candidates stood on both of those. And in our digital ads that drove people to a link where they could download the voter guide, in those videos, we used their own words. We had sound bites from each of them where they said what their position on the issues were. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions and comments. Yes, sir.
Ralph, just on two Supreme Court decisions, how optimistic are you in Donald Trump's first term that those will be overturned and Roe v. Wade can be overturned?
Well, I don't know that I can really speculate without knowing what cases are likely to pen before the court, because the facts will matter in those cases. But if Donald Trump keeps his ironclad pledge to the voters, which I believe he will, to appoint a judicial conservative and a strict constructionist to the court, I think at that point what you do is retain the 5-4 conservative majority. It's not clear to me that with Kennedy in that 5 votes that you necessarily overturn Roe v. Wade. So I'm not really comfortable speculating, but I will say this. I think that the future of the judiciary, that Supreme Court vacancy, the court being evenly divided, and both of them making it abundantly clear in multiple appeals to their respective coalitions and in the debates how they planned to conduct their searches and their selection of nominees, I think it was the sleeper issue for this constituency and probably for a lot of other voters.
And just one follow-up. In terms of Donald Trump's other appointments, would it matter to you, for example, if he appointed Rudy Giuliani as Attorney General, someone who's pro-choice?
I'm not going to speculate about individual names. Yes, ma'am.
Penny Starr with CNS News. You insinuated that the social issues for the GOP are usually pushed aside, and that they played a huge role in getting faith voters out. What changed on that, as far as you're concerned, to make it not only okay that these social issues like abortion and traditional marriage were talked about, but actually influenced, were part of the reason that Trump won?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's something that probably needs some exploring. I don't know that I can give you a final answer today, but I do think that to some extent, not only Trump, but I think some of his fellow candidates in the Republican primaries went to school on Barack Obama's 08 and 12 campaigns. You know, Barack Obama and Joe Biden had that famous episode in, I guess, May of 2012, where Biden got a little over his skis and said on Meet the Press that he believed in same-sex marriage, and then Obama very quickly booked an interview with ABC News and got on the record and touched an issue that most Democrats in prior years would have said, don't make the mistake of waking up this sleeping giant of this faith-based vote. And I think Hillary took that playbook and really doubled down on it with the appeal to Planned Parenthood, accepting their endorsement. Cecile Richards was a top surrogate for her, appeared with her on stage, and there was a I think shamelessness is probably the wrong word, but there was a forthrightness about Hillary's embrace of Planned Parenthood's agenda and the gay lobby's agenda. Remember, the basket of deplorables, that comment was made, I believe, at a Human Rights Campaign Fund dinner. So she was out there, and they had clearly made a decision in 12, not in 8, but in 12, they had made a decision, I would argue, strategically, we're not going to get these faith-based voters. So let's make necessity a virtue, and let's really go after socially liberal voters, including gays and single women and millennials and things of that nature. And so once they did that, I think our candidates and some of our campaign operatives went, well, heck, if they're gonna bring this stuff up proactively and use it to beat us over the head, then let what's good for the goose be good for the gander. I think that's part of what happened. I think another thing that happened, candidly, is when evangelical voters first really broke upon the beaches of the political system in the late 70s and especially in the 80 election, they had been in such a long period of self-imposed exile politically, roughly 3 generations, that it was startling to see them back on the national stage. It would not have been in the 19th century. It would not have been in the early 20th century. Whether it was suffrage or temperance or the anti-slavery movement or the prohibition movement, that activity was part of our politics. But until Jimmy Carter came along in 1976 and said he was born again, this was not really a very bright thread in the fabric of our political system. So I think there was an oddity factor, and the worry was, there's something about this that could frighten people. And I think now we've reached a point of acceptance. We've now been around for so long, roughly 40 years, and we're an accepted part of the conversation we call democracy. And people realize that we're no different than any other constituency. We have certain issues that we really care about. We have some concerns, and we're trying to bring them to bear on the political system, just as the labor unions do for workers' rights issues, just as the feminists do for women's issues, just as the civil rights community does for issues affecting African Americans and other minorities. And so, hey, let everybody have their voice. So I think at a certain point, I know when I first came along in the 80s, I found a lot of reporters were curious to the point of almost, like you were live from outer space in covering us. And I remember Larry Barrett, who was then with Time magazine and was a very big reporter at Time and had covered Reagan, I think covered Reagan at the White House, and he wrote a piece in Time magazine and said, if you don't know very many of these people as a journalist, you may have a problem. And whether you decide to go to church as an individual or not is your own call, but as a reporter, you better get to church, because this is a big constituency and you ought to understand that. And I see that in the rising generation that's come along behind people like the late David Broder or Larry and others. The younger reporters today, they don't seem to react the same way. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one of the strategic imperatives that we not only face going forward after this election, but that we faced going into it. And counterintuitively, I think Trump did a better job than most people thought at beginning to grow that pie. He got a higher share of the Hispanic vote than Mitt Romney did 4 years ago. I think almost nobody, it's within the margin of error, but it's 29 versus 27%. The Democrat share went from 71 to 65 in the network poll. I don't know what Glenn has, but I'm sure it's similar. And when we did the after-action analysis in '04 when I was working for George W. Bush, and he got 44% of the Hispanic vote, we found that the overwhelming majority of that vote was self-identified conservative and self-identified evangelical. That's the natural Republican share of the Hispanic vote. We will drill down on these numbers, and I think we're going to find the same thing. With regard to the African American community, I have been working for decades to build bridges to people of faith in the African American community, churches, individual believers, and pastors and ministers who share many of our views on social issues. And here again, I'm doing this from memory, but I think Trump got 8% of the African American vote, which was, what did Romney get? Like 6? 3? I'm getting different numbers. 6. I know that when I was working for George W. Bush in '04, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, we got 14 to 16% of the African American vote in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and it was driven primarily by these issues and by a proactive effort on our part on the marriage issue, on the life issue, on the religious freedom issue, to build common ground. Now, again, Trump's not going to get a lot of credit, but when was the last time you saw a Republican nominee for president or vice president or any Republican politician of national stature since Jack Kemp who went into African American churches in a general and said, I want to be your champion? So I think we did begin to grow the pie this cycle. We were doing it into 45-mile-an-hour headwinds because we still had Obama embracing her, which made it harder for us, and we had the predominant narrative based on Trump's announcement, and talking about the wall and using some of the language that he used about Hispanics that made it more difficult for us. But now that Obama is going to be leaving, if there's not an African-American candidate on the ticket for the Democrats in 2020, we'll make an even more muscular effort. So it's a very good point, and I always apologize every 2 years that when we use the evangelical shorthand, we are in a political science-y way talking about white evangelicals, but Tim and his team are distributing voter guides in Spanish. They're distributing voter guides in Asian, Korean. They're partnering with African American churches on criminal justice issues every day, and we can talk to you about that on a more individual basis. Yes, sir.
As recently as just a few years ago, you and your group was very friendly to the prospects of immigration reform.
Yep.
With Donald Trump's election and the results of last night, do you feel that the Republican Party no longer has any reason to engage in such an effort? And either way, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, if you go to our website and you read our principles that we believe should guide immigration reform, I think you will find that there is nothing in Donald Trump's position on the need to fix our broken immigration system that is at odds with the principles that we laid down in, I guess that was February of 2013. And I'm doing this from memory, but my recollection is secure the border. You could debate, is that a fence? Is it a wall? Is it a virtual fence? The border should be secured. Secondly, the rule of law. We don't believe the people who entered the country illegally should be treated more favorably or go to the front of the line ahead of people who followed the rules and in some cases waited in lines in other countries for years waiting to get in. Thirdly, we have argued that promoting families and marriages should be at the center of that. So, for example, in the Gang of Eight legislative process, our non-negotiable was that in the bill had to be a provision that would eliminate chain migration, grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and then you just keep going, so that 80% of all the visas, the legal visas, are now chewed up with chain migration and extended family. We said that we thought that that had been a well-intentioned but ultimately a policy mistake, but we said that minor children and spouses should receive first priority for entry. That was in the bill. And then finally, doing a greater amount of immigration based on skills and the ability to perform jobs that the economy needs. Now, I have talked to Donald Trump about this issue. I have also talked to his policy team about the issue. And there's nothing in those are our principles, and they're not going to change. Those are the principles that we spoke to the leaders of both parties after the 2012 election, all through the Gang of Eight process, including to Speaker Boehner and then Majority Leader Cantor, to try to get a vote on the House floor that we never got. And those principles will guide our same conversations with President-elect and President Trump.
Just one
Yeah,
follow-up.
sure.
Certainly when you were laying this out in February 2013, there was nothing even in the imagination of an extra large mass deportation force that Donald Trump has been talking about for a while, which would lead to a lot of families being torn apart. So have you talked to him about that? What are your thoughts on that issue?
I have not talked to him about a quote-unquote deportation force. Yeah, but I think as he moved through the campaign and had multiple additional interviews and meetings with Hispanic leaders and other things of that nature, I'm not a surrogate for Donald Trump, but my recollection is that he revised and extended those remarks and made it clear that he wasn't talking about some special force. He was just talking about enforcing the law, which incidentally, he correctly pointed out in, I think, the second or third debate, that the person who has deported more people who are here illegally than anyone in American history is Barack Obama. And Hillary Clinton never criticized him. He was deporting, I think, up to 400,000 people who were here illegally. We believe very strongly, as a matter of sound public policy and as a matter of biblically inspired moral principles, that the rule of law in a society has to mean something. And if your first act on the journey to becoming a citizen of this country is to break that nation's laws, then there has to be some remedy for that. The devil will be in the details, so to speak. But we oppose blanket amnesty. We have always opposed more favorable treatment for people who entered the country illegally than those who followed the rules. And the reason why, by the way, is because we do partner with Hispanic churches. We do work in the Hispanic community. And most of the Hispanics that we work with entered the country legally. There are 60 million Hispanic Americans in this country. 50 million of them are here legally. And some of them waited for years to get a husband in or a child in. So what do we say to them when we tell them who obeyed the law and did the right thing that there was no advantage to doing that? So we feel pretty strongly about it. Yes?
Neil McKay from Breitbart.
Yeah.
I've been waiting for someone to address it doesn't seem to be a coincidence that so many Mormon leaders came out against Donald Trump. In my own lifetime, I've watched evangelical and Catholic communities come together in ways that my parents never imagined. And I think a lot of that was because of the unity of the pro-life movement.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree.
And I also felt that the Mormons, because of the Mormons and the pro-life movement, there were a lot of communities that came together to march for pro-life. But
And traditional marriage, by the way.
yes, and even Jewish communities. But
Sure.
It struck me as a missing cog that the Mormon community seemed to be out of sync. So many of the political leaders who were Mormons came out just vehemently crazy against Trump.
Mm-hmm.
How do you approach that, and what's your take on it this cycle?
You know, it's a great question. I'll be honest with you, I haven't given a lot of thought to that. I think some of that may have just been pure coincidence based on the fact that the sort of never Trumpster candidate, Evan McMullin, was coincidentally a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And as you would expect to be the case, you know, if he had been an evangelical, there might have been more evangelical leaders who had said, get behind this guy. Or if he had been, say, a devout, strong, committed Roman Catholic, let's say Rick Santorum, let's say he had been the guy. So I think that was probably, I'm speculating, but I think that would have been part of it. And I think part of it was just, again, coincidental in that the previous nominee happened to be a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And during the primaries, Romney, you know, you can have whatever view you want to have of the speech that he gave at the University of Utah, which I guess was in February or March. You know, you can say that it was spoiled, you know, grapes, or you can say that it was a profile in courage. But in that speech, he laid down a pretty strong marker. And he definitely influenced the polling in Utah, we believe. And he probably influenced a lot of Mormon donors and voters who had been excited about him. But beyond that, I don't read a whole lot into it. We have at Faith and Freedom Coalition, and in my previous work at Christian Coalition in the 90s, we have worked hand in glove and seamlessly with members of the Church of Latter-day Saints on issues that we care about for decades. And I will tell you this, no one works harder, nobody puts their money where their mouth is more, and nobody is more committed to those issues, in my experience, than those citizens. So we continue to welcome them and look forward to continuing to work with them. I'll make this the last question, just out of respect for people's time, but I will stay around afterwards if anybody wants to talk to me individually.
Thanks for letting me ask the last question.
Yeah.
Jerome Sokolowski from Religion News Service. I'd like to look forward a little bit, and given what you've presented today, to tell us what you feel Donald Trump owes to white, or just all evangelical Christians, given what you said, and also given the allegations we heard during the campaign of him not adequately compensating people who provided services to his business, whether you think he will deliver.
Well, I think that what he owes to the American people, I don't really want to particularize it to the faith-based voters, because I think he owes the same thing to all voters that he owes to them. And it's what he said last night in his victory speech in New York. He said, this is a great victory, but it isn't enough to win a great victory. We got to do a great job. We have to do the job, and we have to do it well. And I have a fairly broad-gauged view of what that means. I think some people look at it in a very particular way of there are specific issues that we really care about, and we would like for him to deliver on those issues. I think that's entirely appropriate in a democracy. People, whether it's labor unions or feminists or gay and lesbian voters or whoever it is, they go out and say, that gay and lesbian voters said, you promised you would deliver for us on equality. And they held Obama's feet to the fire. But as men and women of faith and as followers of Christ, we have a little bit of a broader view of service, which is that you fulfill that requirement when you serve people and meet their needs. And to us, that means growing the economy, creating jobs, unleashing the wealth-creating capacity of this, the greatest economy on the planet, doing the things that he talked about when he spoke to that charter school in Cleveland about helping not exclusively minority, but many minority students who are trapped in schools where they cannot learn and where they are not safe, and get them in an environment where they can learn and have a bright future. And when it comes to his very strong statements on life, on support for Israel, on the Iran nuclear deal, on religious freedom, and on judges, we fully expect him to keep his pledge, not to us. It wasn't a pledge he made to me or to Faith and Freedom Coalition. It was a pledge that he made to the American people. And based on my interaction with Donald Trump, I have found him to be somebody who, when he says he's going to do something, he does it. Thank you all very much. Thanks for coming.